It's only Tuesday. I am going to attempt to see if I can make sense out of what we've talked about, maybe pull out some larger themes, some larger topics, maybe attempt to put it into a larger context. Because this conference truly was obviously international, but also very interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary. And I'm going to confess, I'm an historian, so I'm going to look at it from a historical perspective. And I'm a historian of German history, but I'm also an American and I live in the United States. I just want to get all my baggage out there on the table so you know perhaps where I'm coming from. I'm also teaching at an institution with a very strong German heritage, so I'm perhaps also biased or influenced by that as well. So just so you know where I'm coming from. Now, I don't want to have long comments because it's already been a long day. And as we all know, historians, we can become rather long-winded on occasion, especially if given the opportunity. So I'll try to keep them as brief as possible, as succinct as I can, but as poignant and as sort of hopefully stimulating, or at least to give you something to think about, maybe try to help you maybe start making some sense of this. You don't have to agree with what I say. Hopefully, I'm sure there's other people here that are coming away or maybe notice some other things. I'm just sharing with you my thoughts. I have been, over the course of the conference, taking notes, making notes, changing notes, and so I'm hoping I can decipher this. This actually looks like the chalkboards and whiteboards I use in the classroom, so you know what my students have to go through. Well, one thing I want to do is, and I've been really thinking about this even more from our lunch conversation page, are we really talking about a legacy? Are we talking about memory? And another word that came to mind, and I don't have the definitive answer, but I've also been thinking about lessons as well, as maybe, and not necessarily lessons that we might learn, but also the people that are involved in all these different stories, the lessons that they also learned, but also the lessons maybe that we've learned. And so legacy or lessons or memories don't just apply, I would say, to those of us who are now talking about it and studying it and trying to learn and discover, remember and make sense of the past, but also those who actually experience the past as well. And so what I want to do is I'm going to try to pull out, there's two themes that come to my mind that I want to try to tease out a little bit that came to my mind. One was this idea of a failed revolution, and I'd like to talk about that. We talked about that over a number of panels. And I do also want to talk about it within the context of, originally I was thinking transatlanticism, but then Niels threw out an idea that I've thought about in another context, but not necessarily in this context. In fact, it was so obvious I didn't see it, but this idea of transnationalism as well. And I'm actually going to then blend them together, sort of segue from one into the other. And so I want to first address this idea of a failed revolution. But if we're going to really talk about the revolution of 1848, I think we really need to look at it in a larger context. I would say the larger, and in fact, I'm not going to talk about it, but, and this is something I do as an historian of modern history, I would start with the Enlightenment. You know, if you look at the world around us and what happened in the subsequent centuries, anything that goes well, you can thank the Enlightenment, and anything that goes bad, you can blame the Enlightenment. But then there's a trajectory that also goes along then, if we want to, out of that tradition of the Enlightenment, all the different ideas that came out of it, we have to look at the dual revolutions. And here I'm talking about the political revolutions, the American and the French political revolution, and also the Industrial Revolution. Okay? And then we also have to throw in there the wars of Napoleon, and taking many of these ideas of the French Revolution, and then also sharing those ideas, but also responding to the Napoleonic expansion, if you will. I'm going to free you, share these ideas with you, and then occupy you at the same time. And then there's also those revolutions of 1820s and the 1830s. These are all tense. But really what makes, I think, 1848 more significant, it was on it's a reaction to the reaction of these dual revolutions in some respects, especially the political revolution. And here we are on a much broader, grander scale in so many different places. I'm oversimplifying, I know. And they had such high aspirations. And nowhere was that much more evident than I would say in what we would call Germany today, Central Europe. The stakes were very, very high there. There were so many aspirations, so many desires, okay? And so if we look, though, at the short term, I think we can probably call it a failure because many of those aspirations, many of those dreams were not necessarily realized, especially that dream of having a united Germany, whether it was a large Germany or a small Germany. But even if we just go into the years already following the revolutions of 1848, we can already see some signs of success. And this has been pointed out on several occasions in several papers. You know, Prussia, the one power that actually played a significant role in suppressing many of the revolutions, actually has a constitution. And it keeps this constitution, which we learned also about in Denmark, also has a constitution. And if we look other countries over time, over the decades, and it takes many until after World War I to have more constitutional regimes. But there's still that trajectory that exists there. And if we just focus on the German case, okay, we can then fast forward, if you will, to Weimar and the Weimar Constitution. And as we've talked about also, many of its antecedents came from the Frankfurt Parliament. If we fast forward then to 1949, to the creation of the Federal Republic of Germany, it learned, if you will, from the lessons of the Weimar era. So if it's learning and building upon that, it can also in some sense trace its roots back to 1848, but even go farther back to some of the ideas, those liberal ideas of democracy, of freedom, of liberty. So there's a long tradition here, okay? And I would also say is, if we go then to 1989, 1990, and we look at, if you sense, all those revolutions that are spreading across Central and Eastern Europe, in many respects, the aspirations of these people's desires are in many respects similar to the revolutions of the early 19th century, the first half. The difference is that these revolutions were much more successful than the revolutions even of 1849, or 1840, I can't say, it's been doing this too long, 1848, 1849. Obviously the conditions, the circumstances were different, but yet we can still talk about that. And we can even talk about it in another context, another idea that also germinates, and as also was expressed by the 48ers both when they were there during the Revolution, but also when they came to America, this idea of a universal idea of democracy. And we can see graded steps in that way in Europe when we talk about the European Union. That many of these ideas, so this is another way that many of these ideas are actually being realized. Another way to measure the success is if we move across that pond we call the Atlantic and come here. We can go to Davenport, we can go to various other places, here in Iowa, in the Midwest, New York, just mention Boston, okay? There's too many cities to mention, so I'm not going to do that. But if we look at that and the people that came here with their myriad of ideas, you know, we talked about there were Republicans, but there were also Democrats, there were also radicals, and they came here to realize their ideas. And as we talked about, there was much success. There was also some failure, or some dreams that weren't realized. But yet, if we look at it in that context, we can also describe then the revolutions of 1848 as a success, without a doubt. And we have all these different ideas that emerge and very diverse. And what happens is, that was pointed out when coming here, and I liked, Christopher, how you pointed that out, you know, for many of these people coming in, the U.S. was almost a tabula rasa, and they projected their ideas of what they think it should be onto this landscape. And so what that means then is, for some of these people, and here that I'm moving slowly into this idea of the transatlanticism or transnationalism. And many of them did come here. They had many aspirations. And they thought that America was going to be their dream, where all these ideas that they had in the Revolution could be realized. And what they discovered, reality did not correspond to their ideals. And for some, that was not necessarily problematic. It motivated them to bring about changes. For others, they tried to bring about changes, but it didn't correspond necessarily to what some people wanted. And therefore, they were not successful. And for some people, America was not the land of milk and honey. And so they had many, perhaps these dreams, these ideals that were never realized, and they were actually a disappointment. But others, though, if you think about it, what we have here is a place where people came, I just lost my train of thought, where people came and actually felt, at least if it doesn't correspond to what I want it to be, I can at least try to make it into what I want it to be. And this continues on. In fact, what I would say then is that, in a sense, many of these 48ers, and I love how Yogi pointed out also the Hungarians came over as well with them, and so it's not just the story of the German 48ers, but of many 48ers. And that's one thing I think that would have been interesting also, on a side note for the conference, is obviously because it's a German-American conference, it already doesn't entirely preclude. We did get some insights from some other areas as well, but it would be nice to have some of those dialogues as well with some of these other revolutionary movements and the experiences of those revolutionaries also in the United States. That would, I think, would be interesting. But what happened is that, and I'm going to come back to this again a little bit later, is that what many of these 48ers tried to do is turn it into the land that they thought it should be. In other words, that they should come to America and set America on the right track of really what it meant to be. Part of the problem was, though, there was not a homogeneous notion of what America should be, even amongst the 48ers. And so you have these competing ideas. But at least they were in a place where they could generally try to realize them, not always successful, and not always warmly received. In fact, there could be opposition as well. But what I would say, though, is that a foundation was laid. And at least in this point, between Germans and America, and where the Germans became intimately, other ethnic groups as well, but we're here at the German-American Conference, where Germans did play a significant role in shaping the identity and politics of this young republic. We get to World War I, and it's a very different relationship. It's a very different reaction to these immigrants, and it's a very different reaction to how then Germany was viewed. What's interesting, though, when we get into the 20s, there's this huge Americanization that takes place in Weimar culture, this embracing of American culture. And we even get there are some dark sides of this relationship, even when the Nazis even begin their ideas of eugenics. Those programs are actually praised by American eugenicists. So there is this this exchange, this relationship much more on a scientific level, but there is this changing in this relationship a little bit. And what's interesting then, once we get into, obviously after 1933, America once again becomes, if you will, a haven for those who are seeking refuge from an oppressive regime. And then we fast forward to 45 and the years that follow. In a sense, we have what I would describe as a role reversal. The 48ers came to America, it didn't correspond to their ideals, and they needed to set America on the right track. After 45, the Americans, and some of the other allies as well, helped Germany set itself back on the track of democracy after the failure of the Weimar Republic, its first experiment in democracy. And it's a relationship that has continued for decades. It's had its ups and downs. But what's really, I think, noteworthy is that we have a situation when we get to 1989 where West Germany becomes then a beacon for many of the states in Eastern Europe as a bastion, if you will, of democracy. And so it actually has embraced, adopted, internalized, and then exuded, projected this image as well. And this was a move that was supported by the United States and was continued to be supported by the United States as well. I would say, though, at the heart of this relationship, is what I can probably, the best way to describe it, because it's otherwise very difficult to describe, because there's so many strands within it, is this idea of an ambiguous, complex notion of liberalism with a capital L. Because it embodies so many things, and I think that's one of the strengths of liberalism, and I think that's also one of its weaknesses at the same time. But this strand, and there's other strands in this relationship between Germany and the United States. I briefly alluded to World War I, I indirectly alluded then to World War II. But nonetheless, it has persisted. And the foundation of this is really these ideas of liberalism. What I mean by that is this idea of representative government, of democracy, and in varying forms, and there's various forms of democracy, there's various forms of representative government, but also of liberal economics, capitalism. Obviously, it manifests itself in different ways. But I would say that is these shared values, these shared ideals, which even though there's some problems in the relationship, as we witnessed with the Iraq War, okay, there was a tense relationship, but we were still bound by these shared values. Okay? And once again, we can even say another manifestation in this is not just through NATO, okay, but we can also see this in other relationships as well, and I would argue one of the most notable is, and I think sometimes for many Americans it's difficult to see it, is in the European Union. And I think for many Americans it's difficult for them to understand, at least those outside maybe this hall right now, this room right now, is the EU, because it's not a country. It's not a state. I'm sure there's some Europeans that have some problems with that as well, but that's a different issue. But if you think about it, the world's largest trading bloc is not the United States, China. The world's largest trading bloc is the United States and the European Union. And they're based upon this idea of a market economy. It's a shared value. And we all know what the motor is that drives the European Union. The German economy. It's the German economy. Not entirely. The Danish too. But there are German euros in Greece, and I don't think there are any.
And the French, don't forget the French.
Don't forget the French. I guess one way what I would do is, I think one way to summarize this and to tie, I think, the present with the past together is to actually use a motto, if you will, of the 48ers, and that's come up before here a few times, and to use this idea of freedom, education, and well-being for all. And I think with those words, I want to end it, especially on that note, well-being for all, because we are then almost done. Yogi's going to have some final words for you, I believe. Anything else you want to say, Yogi?
Sauerkraut.
Sauerkraut.
You are so skinny, you worked so hard, we are concerned as a group, you need vitamins. And to have some happy days like the happy days, you need some gummy bears.
Okay. Thank you very much.